The idea of a house has transformed radically over the course of human history, from the simplest cave dwellings to sprawling McMansions and everything in between. Hi everyone, Ken here. Today we're traveling through time and tracing the evolution of housing over thousands of years. Hit that subscribe button and let's dive into a special episode of This House. In the Paleolithic era, also known as the Old Stone Age, the concept of home was as humble as it gets. Early humans often took shelter in caves or under rocky overhangs when available. Where caves were scarce, they built simple huts from whatever materials they could gather: branches, animal hides, bones, grass, or mud. These structures were usually temporary, suiting a nomadic lifestyle of hunting and gathering. A fire at the entrance or a windbreak of piled brush might be the only amenity, but they provided basic protection from weather and predators. While these first homes were extremely simple, they set the precedent for using local materials and a lot of ingenuity to create safe havens. By the Neolithic era, also known as the New Stone Age, starting around 12,000 years ago, humans began settling down in permanent villages and houses became sturdier. Instead of roaming, people farmed the land, which meant they stayed put and invested more in their dwellings. Mud brick houses were an early innovation. In some of the oldest towns, like Jericho and Colonial, families molded mud and straw into bricks that dried in the sun, then stacked them to form walls. These homes often had plastered interiors and even painted murals, suggesting that even 10,000 plus years ago, people took pride in decorating their homes. In Cappadocia and modern-day Turkey, houses were built touching each other with no street between them. You entered each house through a hatch in the roof, climbing down a ladder. In fact, the rooftops functioned as walkways, essentially a pedestrian highway above the settlement. This unusual design kept the home secure, no easy doors for wild animals or enemies to barge through, and also insulated against the elements, since shared walls meant fewer exposed surfaces. Over in prehistoric Europe, early farmers built impressive longhouses, long, rectangular buildings of wood that could be 150 feet or 45 meters in length and house multiple families. A single longhouse, supported by timber posts with walls of wattle and daub, which were woven sticks smeared with mud, and a thatched roof, might house an entire extended family plus livestock. There were no chimneys and no glass windows. A central hearth smoke would seep out through the thatch, and any light came from small openings or the open door. These Neolithic longhouses are some of humanity's first purpose-built homes, and their sheer scale was unprecedented in their time. As civilization advanced, so did home construction. In ancient river valley cultures, in places like Mesopotamia, Egypt, and the Indus Valley, we find the first planned towns and diverse house styles. One theme, however, stayed consistent. Homes were built with earthen materials like mud, brick, or clay, since wood was scarce or valuable for other uses. Let's hopscotch around a few ancient cultures, starting with Mesopotamia. Along the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, cities like and Babylon were essentially clusters of mud brick buildings. Ordinary people lived in mud brick houses, which were often built around an inner courtyard. In the hot climate, an open-air courtyard brought in light and served as a cool ventilated core since the surrounding rooms typically had no windows. So the rooms, for cooking, sleeping, storage, all opened onto this little central patio. From the street, these houses were unassuming, windowless mud walls and a single door. Privacy and protection were paramount. Family life happened hidden from the bustling bazaar outside. A typical Mesopotamian home was 1 story tall with a flat roof, and people often slept on the roof on hot nights. Wealthier families might have a second floor and a larger courtyard, but even a mansion in Babylon followed the same inward-focused layout. Crowding was an issue in ancient cities too. Homes shared walls and packed in tightly along narrow lanes. In short, Mesopotamia gave us the archetype of the courtyard house, a style still found in many Middle Eastern cities today because its common-sense design is superbly adapted to hot, dry climates. Meanwhile, in Egypt's Nile Valley, the pattern was similar, but with local twist. Egyptian commoners lived in mud brick houses that did an excellent job moderating the desert heat. Walls were thick and often whitewashed to reflect sunlight. Roofs were flat and made of mud-coated wood beams. Families might spread mats and sleep up there to catch the night breeze. Windows, if present, were tiny high openings with perhaps a wooden shutter, mainly to let out smoke. They still had no glass. A typical peasant home might be 2 or 3 rooms or just a single room. On the other hand, wealthier Egyptians, think minor nobility or successful merchants, had larger homes, sometimes 2 stories around a small courtyard garden. These bigger homes might feature painted walls or columns at the entry and separate areas for cooking, sleeping, and entertaining. One thing even the rich didn't do: build in stone. The grand stone temples and pyramids were reserved for gods and the dead. Living people of all classes mostly stuck to the trusty mud brick. As a result, few ancient Egyptian houses survive except the foundations, but detailed paintings show us colorful interiors with wall paintings, pottery, and furniture like beds and stools. They also show that life often took place outside or on the roof, a necessity in such a sunny climate. And when the annual Nile flood came, those wisely built houses on slightly higher ground or on platforms stayed dry, most of the time. If not, well, mud brick was cheap and fairly easy to DIY. On the other side of the Mediterranean, Greek houses were quite modest compared to their famous temples and public buildings. In classical Athens, a typical urban house was made of mud bricks on a stone foundation with a tiled roof. The floor plan usually centered around an open courtyard, are you sensing a trend, which provided light and ventilation. Around the courtyard, several small rooms served flexible purposes. There wasn't an emphasis on rigid room functions. The same space might be a dining area one evening and a sleeping quarters the next. Wealthier Greeks had a bit more specialization. They might have an andron, a sort of men's dining room for hosting symposiums, which was usually the nicest furnished room, and a separate women's quarters known as the gynoeceum, often upstairs or in the back, for the women of the house to work and socialize away from the men. But even rich houses were relatively small, often 5 to 7 rooms total, cramped into the dense city fabric of Athens or Corinth. Windows were little and high up, without glass, so interiors were dim. Most cooking was probably done in the courtyard to keep smoke out of the house. Privacy was important. Houses presented a plain face to the street, and the noisy public life was left at the door. Interestingly, Greek houses did not show off wealth on the exterior. That was reserved for public buildings. Even a prosperous merchant's home might look like a mud brick box from outside. Comfort was also basic. Braziers for heat, as there were no built-in fireplaces in early periods, and oil lamps for light. Over time, especially in Hellenistic eras, some Greek homes incorporated more lavish touches, mosaic floors, peristyle colonnades in the courtyard, and more, but they never became palaces. Land was limited, and the idea of a huge private home to show off wasn't really a thing in classical Greek culture. That came later with the Romans. Now the Romans, they did love a good mansion if they could afford it. Roman housing ranged from cramped apartments for the poor to elegant villas for the rich. In cities like Rome or Pompeii, a wealthy family would occupy a domus, which was a private townhouse typically 1 or 2 stories high. A domus had a distinctive layout. You'd step in from the street through a narrow entrance hall and emerge into an atrium, a central hall open to the sky with a pool in the middle to catch rainwater. The atrium was the heart of the home, a place to impress guests with displays of family wealth, like statues or expensive furniture. Around it were small bedrooms and meeting rooms, and at the back, many domus had a peristyle, a courtyard garden surrounded by columns. This inward-facing plan meant even in a dense city, the family had private open space. The walls were often decorated with vibrant fresco paintings and floors with mosaics. They also enjoyed conveniences like piped water from aqueducts and private baths for the very well-to-do. It's no wonder that when we think of Roman houses, we imagine opulence. Some were truly sumptuous. But it's important to note, most Romans did not live like that. The majority lived in insulae, which were essentially ancient apartments or tenements. These buildings were typically 3 to 5 stories tall and housed dozens of families in tiny units. The ground floor usually had shops or taverns, and better-off folks might rent the slightly less terrible lower apartments. The higher up you went, the smaller, cheaper, and hotter the units became. These buildings were typically brick-faced concrete or wood construction, and they had a nasty habit of collapsing or catching fire due to hasty construction and overcrowding. For water or toilets, most people in insulae used public fountains and latrines. It was noisy, smelly, and cramped living, truly how the other half lives compared to the airy courtyards of the rich. Outside the cities, Romans who could afford it escaped to country estates. A villa could be a luxurious retreat with gardens, baths, and multiple wings, or it could be a more modest farmhouse villa where a retired soldier might putter in his vineyard. In any case, by the height of the Roman Empire, they had developed a wide range of housing types and even early real estate markets. From Rome to Pompeii to provinces like Britain or Egypt, archaeologists find that Roman houses share common features of design and comfort. Underfloor heating, glass windows, mosaic tile floors. The Romans brought many innovations that made home life more comfortable, some of which wouldn't be seen again until after the Dark Ages. The fall of Rome led to a return to simplicity in many respects. In the early medieval period, political chaos and economic decline meant most people lived in very basic structures again. However, as the Middle Ages progressed, distinct housing emerged for different social classes. The peasantry had their cottages, the burghers had narrow townhouses, and the nobility barricaded themselves in castles or manor houses. Let's break it down. The vast majority of medieval people were peasants, farmers living in villages on a lord's land. Their homes were extremely modest. A typical peasant cottage in early medieval Europe was a one-room hut made of wood or woven sticks plastered with wattle and daub and topped with a thatched roof. As far as floors, just dirt, maybe with some straw thrown down. For windows, perhaps a tiny opening or two, no glass, maybe a shutter or just open. There was usually a single hearth in the center or against a wall used for cooking and heating. Early on, these hearths did not have chimneys. Smoke just accumulated under the roof and slowly leaked out through the thatch or a hole in the roof, which meant the interior was perpetually smoky and sooty. Furnishings were sparse, a couple of stools, maybe a crude table, and straw mats or simple beds for sleeping. Privacy was non-existent. The whole family slept in that one room, often with the animals inside as well. It was common to partition off one end of the house for a cow, goats, or chickens, especially overnight, to prevent theft or wolf attacks. This made the living quarters even more crowded, and yes, smelly, but the body heat of the animals actually provided a bit of extra warmth in winter. Over the medieval period, some peasants improved their lot and built slightly larger houses, perhaps 2 rooms instead of 1, or an upper loft for sleeping. In later medieval England, for example, the classic hall and parlor cottage had one main room, a hall, plus a smaller room for sleeping or storage, a parlor. We also start seeing more half-timbered houses, exposed wood frame with plaster infill, as carpentry techniques improved. But even in 1400, a peasant's home was incredibly basic by modern standards, dark, smoky, cold, and cramped. These houses also didn't last long. Thatch and mud walls need constant maintenance. It's actually a small miracle any medieval cottages have survived to today. Yet, for all their shortcomings, these humble homes were the centers of family life, and many generations made do within their dim confines. Starting around the 11th century, European towns began to revive and grow, and with them came a new class of people, merchants and craftsmen who weren't peasants or nobles. They lived in towns and needed houses that fit on narrow city lots. The result was the medieval townhouse or burgher house, often a tall, skinny building facing the street. Picture a bustling medieval street, overhanging upper floors, timber-framed buildings painted in ochre or white, shop signs hanging, and people throwing wastewater out of windows. The ground floor of a typical townhouse often served as a shop or workshop, open to the street, and the family would live upstairs. Because land within city walls was limited, they built upwards, 2, 3, sometimes 4 stories. Each floor jettied out a bit over the one below to gain extra space. These overhangs, called jetties, also had a practical side benefit. They sheltered the storefronts from rain and slightly widened the cramped street at upper levels, but they also meant upper floors of houses on opposite sides of a street nearly touched. These houses were timber-framed and often filled in with plaster or brick for better fire resistance than all-wood construction. Still, medieval cities were tinderboxes. The combination of open hearths, candles, and dense wood buildings meant devastating fires were common. London, for instance, burned multiple times even before the famous Great Fire of 1666. At the top of medieval society were the nobility, lords, knights, princes, and they had 2 main types of residence, the manor house and the castle. Early medieval nobles often lived in relatively simple manor houses, which were basically large farmhouses on their estates. But as the Middle Ages went on, and especially as feudal conflicts erupted, nobles fortified their homes. The classic medieval castle evolved around the 10th and 12th centuries out of necessity for defense. The earliest castles were wooden palisades on earthen mounds, but these soon gave way to formidable stone castles with high walls, towers, and moats. While castles were military structures, they were also homes for the lord, his family, and a small army of retainers and servants. Life in a castle was a mix of grandeur and discomfort. The central space was the Great Hall, a large room where everyone ate together and where the lord might hold court. It had a high ceiling and a big hearth, or even an open fire pit. Tapestries weren't just for show, they were hung on walls to help insulate the damp stone rooms against the chill. Over time, castles did incorporate some improved creature comforts. By the 1200s, many castles had built-in fireplaces and chimneys in private chambers, a huge leap for warmth. They also had a type of primitive indoor plumbing, stone latrines or garter-robes that let waste drop down chutes in the walls or directly into the moats. Not exactly modern bathrooms, but better than a chamber pot in the corner. Private rooms called cellars emerged. Basically, the lord's family's private living room, often upstairs and slightly away from the noisy hall. Still, privacy was minimal. Bedrooms often had multiple occupants, even the lord and lady might have servants sleeping on the floor of their chamber. Everyone was in everyone's business by today's standards. Manor houses, the country homes on estates in later medieval times, became more comfortable and less fortress-like, especially in safer regions. For example, in the 14th and 15th centuries, many English and French manors were essentially early stately homes, moated perhaps with gatehouses but designed for comfort as much as defense. They featured multiple rooms, glass windows, chimneys, and richly carved wood interiors. Castles themselves by late Middle Ages started to include decorative gardens and aesthetic improvements as the need for serious fortification waned. By the close of the medieval period, the homes of the wealthy were poised to transform into the palaces and manors of the Renaissance. The Renaissance was a rebirth of art and learning, and architecture too. As people rediscovered classical Greek and Roman ideas, wealthy homeowners decided they wanted houses inspired by the elegance of antiquity. Meanwhile, the Age of Exploration saw Europeans carrying their house styles overseas, adapting them to new lands and climates in the Americas, Africa, and Asia. So this period is a fascinating mix, renewed creativity in home design in Europe and the transplantation and transformation of those designs abroad. If you were a rich banker or noble in 15th century Italy, the trendy thing to do was build an urban palazzo. Take the Medici family in Florence. Their Palazzo Medici became a prototype for Renaissance mansions. These city palaces were typically 3 stories, built of stone or stucco, and had a very symmetrical, orderly facade, often with classical details like columns, pilasters, and arched windows. The ground floor might be rusticated, giving a strong, fortress-like base, a nod to security as well as style. Inside, however, there was usually a lovely open courtyard with columns and maybe a loggia. Rooms were arranged around this courtyard on each floor. There was a clear sense of proportion and harmony in these designs, influenced by architects like Alberti and Brunelleschi, who studied Vitruvius, an ancient Roman architect. The Renaissance home also embraced comfort and beauty. High ceilings with carved wooden beams or frescoed panels, large rectangular windows, fireplaces in multiple rooms, and specialized spaces, dining rooms, studies, libraries, which started to emerge as separate from just a big hall. These houses weren't defensive castles, they were status symbols in the heart of the city, often situated near a public square or on a main street. The trend spread across Europe, and in France, the Renaissance style blended with local Gothic to help create the famous chateaux of the Loire Valley. Picture turreted manor palaces like Chambord, which have Renaissance symmetry and detail but still a fairy tale castle vibe. In England, the Renaissance arrived a bit late and mingled with Tudor style. Affluent Elizabethan homes like Hardwicke Hall sported huge grids of windows, hence the saying, Hardwicke Hall, more glass than wall. A status symbol showing glass was now achievable in quantity. Across the board, one big change from medieval homes was bigger windows and more light. Glassmaking had improved, and the fear of structural weakness from openings eased with better engineering. By the 17th century, cities like London and Amsterdam saw rows of townhouses influenced by classical principles. For instance, the famous canal houses of Amsterdam's Golden Age have tall, narrow fronts with decorative gables. Not exactly classical columns, but they adhere to uniform height and elegant proportions along the canal. In London, after the Great Fire of 1666, rebuilding efforts led to the Georgian style, which was basically a Renaissance-derived neoclassicism. Uniform brick facades, sash windows arranged symmetrically, and aligned doors. So in essence, the Renaissance and the following Baroque and Georgian eras brought a formal quality to homes. Streetscapes became more regular, houses were designed not just for function or defense, but to present a cultured face. Homes became places to display art, to host salons or scholarly pursuits, a far cry from the one-room medieval hut. And crucially, if you were rich, you could now expect a level of comfort that set you apart from the poor even more. At the same time European styles were flowering, Europeans were also colonizing new lands. Naturally, they brought their architectural ideas with them, but often had to adapt to local climates and materials. So colonial architecture is like an experiment. The same basic European plans, tweaked by environment and necessity. Spanish colonists in the Americas built homes reminiscent of Spain, and by extension, influenced by Moorish design. The hallmark was the courtyard house, casa hacienda or casa de patio. Whether in Mexico, Peru, or Florida, many Spanish colonial homes have a central patio, an open courtyard often with a fountain or garden. Rooms open to this patio, similar to houses in Spain or even ancient Rome, which provides shade and ventilation in hot climates. The materials were local, adobe bricks or stone, usually plastered over and whitewashed. Red clay tile roofs were standard, giving that distinctive look and durability against rot. The British brought different traditions to what became the United States and Canada. Early on, homes in New England were essentially improved versions of medieval cottages, timber frame, wattle and daub or clapboard, steep roofs, central hearths, because settlers were focused on survival, not style. But as the colonies became established and wealthy, especially by the 18th century, they followed Georgian architectural trends from Britain. The result was the classic Georgian colonial house, a two-story rectangular box with a symmetrical facade. Typically it had a center hall floor plan. You enter into a hallway with stairs and rooms on either side in a mirrored layout. The front door often had a decorative crown or pediment, and sometimes even columns or pilasters flanking it, imitating a little Greek temple entrance. Windows were multi-pane sash windows aligned evenly around the door, usually 5 across the upper floor and 5 across the lower, with the door in the middle, the 5-bay facade. In New England, these houses were wood, while in the southern colonies, they might be brick or wood imitating brick. Interiors featured separate rooms like parlors, dining rooms, and bedrooms, a big change from all-purpose halls of earlier days. Fireplaces were in every major room for heat. One famous subtype, the Southern Plantation House, took Georgian plans and added elements for the climate, often column porches or verandas to provide shade, raised foundations to avoid floodwaters and catch breezes, and high ceilings for cooling. Meanwhile, the simpler folk in the colonies lived in more basic farmhouses or log cabins on the frontier, but as prosperity grew, even vernacular homes started copying the Georgian template. By the late 1700s, you could find symmetry and sash windows on houses up and down the eastern seaboard from Boston to Charleston. In the Louisiana Territory, French settlers had their own take. A classic French colonial house might be a raised cottage on piers to avoid swampy ground, with a broad hip roof extending over a wraparound porch called a gallery. These had French doors, big windows, and often no hallways. Rooms opened directly onto the porch for ventilation. They were usually of wood frame construction. It's a style well suited to hot, wet climates and is an early ancestor of the Creole townhouses and shotgun houses of the Gulf Coast. By the end of the colonial era, many colonial homes, especially the affluent, were as refined as any in Europe, just with a new twist. Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, for example, was basically a Palladian neoclassical villa placed on a Virginia hilltop. The stage was set for the young United States and other colonies to soon develop their own regional architectural flares. The 19th century unleashed massive changes in how people lived. Industrialization led to rapid urban growth. Cities swelled with factories and workers, and housing struggled to keep up with the exploding population. At the same time, new technologies like cheap steel, elevators, and electric lights began to influence residential construction. Early industrial cities like London, Manchester, New York, or Paris grew at breakneck speed. Workers flocked in, and housing construction couldn't keep pace, or when it did, it often did so in the shoddiest way possible. The result was the notorious tenement. These were basically cheap apartment buildings crammed with as many rental units as possible, built by developers looking to profit from the housing shortage. In New York's Lower East Side, for example, a typical tenement around 1860 was a 25-foot wide, 5-story building with 4 families squeezed onto each floor sharing 2 toilets in the yard. Rooms were dark, often with no windows. Interior rooms had no source of light or air. Prior to laws, many tenements were literally windowless fire traps. One description from an 1800s New York health report said, "Hundreds of people are packed into spaces with no ventilation and little light. The halls are dark tunnels reeking of filth." Infectious disease ran rampant. Tuberculosis, cholera, etc. found ideal breeding grounds in these conditions. In London, similar overcrowding in back-to-back terrace houses and courtyard slums prompted Charles Dickens to write bleak descriptions of housings in novels like Oliver Twist. Basically, the early Industrial Revolution produced urban housing worse in some ways than what came before. Density and profit were prioritized over health and comfort. Over time, reformers started pushing back. By the late 19th century, laws in some cities required basic improvements. New York's Tenement House Act of 1901, for instance, mandated windows in every room, among other things. Europe saw model housing experiments too, such as Activia Hill's improved worker houses in London, but these were limited. Not everyone in the city lived in squalor. The growing middle class, managers, clerks, skilled tradespeople, created a demand for better housing. Enter the row house or terraced house in Britain. Row houses are essentially a compromise between individual homes and apartments. You get your own house, but it shares its sidewalls with its neighbors in a long row, saving space and construction cost. In American cities like Philadelphia, Boston, and New York, rows of brownstone and brick townhouses line newly gridded streets. A typical row house might be 2 to 3 stories high plus a basement, perhaps 15 to 20 feet wide. The layout often had a parlor in front, a dining room behind, and a kitchen either at the back or in the basement, and the bedrooms would be upstairs. By late century, many row houses had gas lighting, coal furnaces or stoves, and even rudimentary plumbing. They also sported big windows thanks to mass-produced glass. Multi-pane sash or tall casement windows were affordable and let in ample light. Styles varied. Early 1800s ones were often plain Federal or Georgian style. Later Victorian-era row houses had fancy trim, bay windows, and ornate cornices. In Paris, the equivalent for the middle classes was the apartment building. Haussmann's redesign of Paris in the 1850s and 1860s created boulevards lined with elegant 5-story stone buildings, each floor occupied by a separate apartment. These Parisian apartments were quite spacious for their time and became a model for European city housing. Whether in a row house or an apartment block, the urban middle class by the late 19th century enjoyed a quantum leap in domestic comfort. The 1800s also saw the birth of what we'd now call suburbs. As cities grew congested, those who could afford to started moving a bit further out where there was space and cleaner air. Early suburbs were enabled by new transport, first omnibuses and trains, and later streetcars. London had railway suburbs by the 1850s, where commuters took the train in from outskirts like Richmond or Greenwich. In the US, one of the first true suburbs was Brooklyn Heights, which became viable when a steam ferry service to Manhattan began in 1814. These proto-suburbs featured houses that were often detached or semi-detached with yards or gardens, a huge contrast to the row upon row of attached houses in the city. Architecture in the mid to late 19th century went through many revival styles: Gothic Revival, Italianate, Queen Anne, Romanesque, and more, and suburban homes became a canvas for those. The American middle-class house in this era often had a picturesque asymmetrical shape, with wraparound porches, bay windows, and turrets made easier by industrial production of complex wood trim and the affordability of using wood framing. The balloon frame invented around 1830 made it cheap and quick to put up wooden houses with pre-cut studs and nails. So whereas a city row house was constrained in shape, a freestanding suburban house could sprawl and sprout quirks. The late 1800s American suburbs loved the Queen Anne style and smaller folk Victorian style with their decorative shingles, fancy porches, and multicolored paint jobs. Meanwhile, in Britain, late Victorian suburbs might feature semi-detached houses, essentially a pair of mirror-image homes attached, giving each the feel of a corner property and a bit of front and back garden. The garden as a prized part of a home really started to come into play, a throwback to the idea of landed gentry, but on a smaller scale for the clerks and merchants who wanted a bit of nature. Also critical in the 19th century were infrastructure improvements. Cities began installing sewer systems, London's in the 1860s for example, and many European cities soon after, which gradually allowed the advent of indoor bathrooms for those who could connect. Gas pipes brought light and fuel for stoves into homes by mid-century. Later, electrical grids, by the 1880s and 90s in some places, brought electric light. The first residential electric lights appeared in wealthy homes and in model tenements as a safety measure. After all, it was less fire risk than oil lamps. The invention of the elevator and structural steel also paved the way for the first residential skyscrapers in the early 20th century. Though a few high-end multi-story apartment hotels in the 1880s, like New York City's Dakota building, proved that affluent people could be convinced to live in apartments if amenities and status were high enough. By 1900, the housing landscape had completely transformed. Millions lived in industrial city housing, ranging from grim tenements to luxurious apartments. Millions of others had moved to newly urbanized suburbs, commuting by train or tram to jobs in the city center, which was a new pattern of living. The idea of homeownership for the middle class was taking root, especially in places like the US, where land was ample. Owning a home with a bit of land became a societal goal, distinguishing oneself from the toiling masses in rented quarters. Yet the tenement problem was still severe, and reformers were gearing up with visions of garden cities and other utopian ideas to solve urban crowding. The stage was set for the 20th century to take these ideas, technology, suburbanization, and social reform, and make the simple idea of housing about as complex as possible. In the early 1900s, architecture entered an experimental phase. The ornate styles of the 19th century gave way to the desire for new forms appropriate to an industrial age. Architects in Europe and America began championing modernism, which in housing meant cleaner lines, open spaces, and new materials. A pivotal idea came from architects like Le Corbusier, who famously outlined 5 points of new architecture for houses, using 1, pilotis, also known as columns, to lift the building off the ground, 2, having a free facade, non-load-bearing walls that can be designed freely, 3, an open floor plan, walls placed freely thanks to a structural frame, 4, horizontal ribbon windows, and 5, a roof terrace. His 1929 design, the Villa Savoye in France, embodies this. It's a white boxy building elevated on thin columns with long bands of windows and a flowing open interior, radically different from a cozy cottage. Inside, rooms flowed into each other without the small box chambers of traditional homes, creating a sense of space and light. Similarly, in America, Frank Lloyd Wright was designing his prairie houses like the Roby House, with low-pitched roofs and open living areas that blurred into one another, creating a family living space rather than formal parlors. The Bauhaus school in Germany also influenced residential design with its emphasis on functionality and affordability. Apartment buildings like the 1920s Bauhaus design Siedlungen in Berlin were simple, flat-roof blocks with cubic forms and minimal ornament, meant to house people efficiently. For the average person, these avant-garde designs might have seemed strange at first. Many still preferred a house with a pitched roof and traditional look, but modernism gained ground mid-century, especially after World War II. By the 1950s and 60s, a mid-century modern aesthetic took hold in many suburban developments. Think open-plan ranch houses in California with big glass sliders to the patio, or the post and beam glass houses that popped up as luxury experiments, like Philip Johnson's famous glass house. Apartment living also got a modernist makeover. High-rise residential towers, often in the international style, essentially sleek glass and steel boxes, appeared in cities worldwide. Some were luxury buildings offering doormen and views, others were public housing blocks aiming to give the masses a modern lifestyle in the sky. One of modernism's lofty goals was to use industrial methods to solve housing shortages, prefabrication and mass production of housing. This saw some success, prefab concrete apartment slabs in Europe or modular home kits in the US, but also failures. Notorious large public housing projects like Pruitt-Igoe in St. Louis imploded in 1972 after only 18 years, symbolizing the flaws in a one-size-fits-all tower block approach. Love it or hate it, the legacy of modernism is huge. Open floor interiors are now standard, as are large windows, and the stripping of craftsmanship and artistry in favor of mass-produced finishes are the norm. If one image symbolizes mid-20th century housing, it's the endless tract of look-alike houses with lawns and driveways, often referred to as cookie cutters. After World War II, especially in the United States, but elsewhere too, there was an explosion of suburban development. Several factors drove this: returning veterans needing housing, government policies that made mortgages affordable like the GI Bill in the US, and the boom of car ownership and highway building that made living outside the city feasible. The most famous example is Levittown, a planned suburb started in 1947 on Long Island, New York. The Levittown company basically applied assembly line methods to building houses, putting up thousands of nearly identical small houses at a breakneck pace. These were originally around 750 square feet, with 2 bedrooms and a bathroom. Cozy by today's suburban standards, but a dream for young families moving out of apartments or shared quarters. Levittown was rapidly followed by many other mass subdivisions across the country. The early suburbs featured modest, single-story houses, yards for kids to play, and schools and shopping centers popping up to serve the new communities. Over time, the houses got bigger, second floors, attached garages, etc., but the ethos remained: a private home for each nuclear family, removed from the density and perceived problems of the city. Culturally, this reshaped notions of the good life. The suburban home became synonymous with prosperity and middle-class identity in places like the US, Australia, and parts of Europe. Of course, it also had downsides: sprawl, car dependence, and often social segregation. But in terms of housing evolution, suburbia was the defining feature of the late 20th century. By 1970, a majority of Americans, for instance, lived in suburbs rather than city centers. Similar trends occurred in the UK. The Metroland suburbs of London were expanded, and new towns were built. Houses themselves also evolved, from small boxes to the larger split levels in the misguidedly named Colonials of the 1970s, and by the 1980s and 90s into the McMansion era, where bigger was better. So what is a McMansion? The term emerged in the late 20th century as a snarky way to describe the phenomena of large, mass-produced suburban houses that were often criticized for being gaudy or poorly designed. Picture a newly built house in a suburban subdivision. It's oversized, has an imposing, sometimes chaotic facade with a mix of faux architectural elements. A wannabe turret here, a Palladian window there, gables and dormers stuck on for effect, and typically a prominent multi-car garage that faces the street. Essentially a grand show of architectural illiteracy being marketed as the new dream. These houses earned the nickname McMansion because, like fast food, they were accused of being a low-quality imitation of luxury, pumped out quickly for mass consumption. In the 1990s housing boom, developers in the US especially built lots of these in suburban developments, but architects often cringed at their inconsistent style and sometimes shoddy construction, using cheap materials like vinyl siding and only putting brick on the front facade of the house. Yet they filled a market demand. Land on the fringe of metro areas was relatively cheap, people wanted more space, and with two-income households and easy credit, many could afford bigger mortgages. By 2005, the average new American home size ballooned to over 2,400 square feet, roughly twice what it was in 1950. In other countries with space, like Australia or Canada, similar trends appeared. However, not everyone was on board with the bigger is better mantra. Some critics pointed out that these houses were often functionally inefficient, requiring an excess of resources for heating, watering lawns, and containing wasted space. This era also saw the proliferation of gated communities where many McMansions reside, adding a layer of exclusivity and security, or at least the feeling of it. It's worth noting, by the late 2010s, trends began shifting slightly as some younger buyers showed renewed interest in city living or smaller homes, but the legacy of the McMansion era is physically built into the landscape of countless suburbs. A parallel thread in the 20th century was the attempt to provide decent housing for low-income people through government programs. This took different forms. In Europe, many countries built large council housing or social housing estates, sometimes rows of low-rise flats, other times high-rise towers to replace slums and war damage. Some of these were done thoughtfully and remained popular, others became new centers of poverty. In the US, public housing projects in mid-century often meant high-rise complexes like Chicago's infamous Cabrini Green or St. Louis's Pruitt-Igoe that by the late 1970s were plagued with problems and later demolished. The early optimism that modernist high-rises could house the masses in utopian fashion often failed due to poor maintenance, lack of social infrastructure, and concentration of poverty. By century's end, new approaches like mixed-income developments and vouchers tried to correct these mistakes. In any case, the 20th century city had a new feature: the residential skyscraper. From luxury towers in Manhattan, like the Art Deco master apartments in 1929, to massive Le Corbusier-inspired slab blocks in Moscow or Hong Kong, building up became a solution for high land cost and density. And with inventions like air conditioning and fast elevators, living on the 30th floor became feasible and even prestigious. Today, cities like New York or Dubai have truly tall condo towers that are essentially vertical neighborhoods for the wealthy. Now we arrive at the current era, and it is a work in progress. The 21st century home is being shaped by new priorities and challenges: sustainability, technology, urbanization, and changing demographics. While it's hard to predict exactly where housing will go, some clear trends have emerged in the first quarter of the century. First off, buildings account for a huge portion of energy use and emissions, so modern home design is increasingly focused on being resource responsible. This means better insulation, solar panels on roofs, energy-efficient appliances, and designs that work with the local climate rather than against it. Second, technology has truly entered the home. The smartphone revolution in the late 2000s led to the smart home revolution. Now, you can control your lights, thermostats, security cameras, door locks, you name it, from an app with voice commands. We seem to be headed in a hands-free direction, but only time will truly tell. Third, the 21st century is also a time where people more globally live in cities than rural areas. This means housing shortages in many big cities, driving up costs and forcing innovation. One trend is micro-apartments, very small apartments that are cleverly designed with transformable furniture so that a tiny space can still meet its occupants' needs. And with financial pressures in suburbs, we see trends like multi-generational housing becoming more common. Houses with in-law suites or dual owners' bedrooms to accommodate elderly parents or adult kids returning home. Ultimately, the story of housing is ongoing. From caves to smart homes, one constant thread is human ingenuity in creating shelter that suits our needs and aspirations. Whether we've stacked mud bricks or 3D printed our dwellings, we've always balanced practicality with social and cultural meaning. Each era's solutions, whether it was a thatched hut or a digital condo, teach us something about how to live. And as needs and technology change, so will our homes, continually reflecting who we are and what we value at that moment in time. Here's to the next chapter in the ever-evolving adventure of Home Sweet Home. And with that, I'll turn it over to you. I know we covered a lot in this video, but I'd love to hear your thoughts down below in the comments section. And while you're there, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an exciting episode of This House.